Bye, Nadia. Thank you. First thing, for everyone's preferences for what they want to do for the spa, i.e. if you want to judge, speak, in whatever position, if you want a panel chair or whatever, can you send me your preference just on Messenger? I'll hopefully get the draw done while you guys are motion prepping. Secondly, the workshop is starting. So let's get started. I'm going to tell you guys a bit about how to debate the Middle East and just some strategy and some content related to that. So this is the Middle East. The reason I show you guys this is that I think the first step to take is not to view the Middle East as this ubiquitous country type thing where everything interacts in sort of the same way. There's this really, really good workshop online. It's called Africa is Not a Country. I want this to be quite similar to that insofar as like all of these countries interact very differently. All of these countries have very different proceedings within them. They have very dissimilar systems of governance. And though there are some things that are very common, which we'll talk about, I think it's like breaking those generalizations and breaking those deadlocks that happen to be better in Middle East debates. So firstly, just some miscellaneous strategic notes. So I think the first thing, and this is quite unfortunate, is that spec is quite panel or chair dependent uniquely in Middle East debates. That is to say, for example, in like Russia debates, US debates, China debates, chairs are becoming increasingly more receptive to spec because it becomes more and more AIV knowledge. The unfortunate thing with the Middle East is that a lot of it is AIV knowledge, but the chair just doesn't know it. So the task here for you is to take the spec and analyze it strategically within the debate. So what structural systems are surrounding this spec which makes this spec believable in the context of a VP debate. And the second thing is that generalizations are kind of hard to overcome. The reason for this is because people, when debating the Middle East, say two things to justify anything. The first thing they say is monarchies, and the second thing they say is Sharia law. And after this, they're like, yeah, everything happens because of these things. And then they say things like women are not allowed to breathe in the Middle East, or like all they do is export oil because like the monarchy can do that. This is obviously not how the Middle East works. I think hopefully when you understand more about the economic systems surrounding the Middle East, and other political systems that exist, you'll be able to overcome these generalizations. And the third thing, and this will be an important note going forward, is that the Middle East is one of the most dynamic regions in the world. So that is to say that you guys need to be consistently reading up on the Middle East. It's always changing. There's always economic, political, religious, everything shifts around in the Middle East. So this is an important thing to take into account. Cool. The first thing is just a note on the occupied Palestinian territories, Lebanon and Israel. The ongoing humanitarian crisis in this region of the world will not be covered in this workshop. There's two reasons for this. The first reason is that it is so ubiquitously changing all the time in the status quo at the time of recording that I feel like it wouldn't be very helpful if I was to tell you facts right now because they could change the next day. I think the second thing, and this is a more important thing, is that as members of EUDU and also as my friends, I see it as kind of an expectation that you guys read up on literally what is the most well-documented humanitarian crisis in the world. So I don't think it's very useful for me to tell you anything about this. I hope you guys will know about it. The same thing with the Houthis in Yemen. I won't be covering that. What will we cover then? We're covering oil and post-oil states, MR, Iran, Turkey, and sovereign wealth funds. Let's go. Okay. So firstly, placing all of these things in Middle Eastern debates, and what do they look like? I think the first thing that's quite common for Middle East debates is Middle Eastern politics in like over anything else like society or the economy and things like that. So for example, this house believes that the decision to normalize the relationship with Bashar al-Assad is in the interest of the Arab League. So it's to say that there's a lot of IR and politics related things when talking internally about the Middle East. And the second thing is things like Asian markets and Asian banking. And notably here, often you'll get a debate about like the establishment of some sort of wealth fund or the establishment of some sort of bank in Asia, where the implicit burden of the motion is to like compare it against the Middle Eastern markets and how it will compete and or how it will fit into these markets. So for example, this like Filipino investment fund, obviously internally the burden, it's not suggested that this thing is going to compete with other sovereign wealth funds that exist in the Middle East, but realistically in the context of the debate, it's probably going to do that. The third thing is just miscellaneous events that happen, notably sporting events, so like the Qatar Grand Prix, the World Cup, the Saudi Arabia Grand Prix, and usually the trade-off here is, you know, like you're required to address things like their economic systems, things like slavery, and things like other laws that exist within the Middle East, and some of these countries that are hosting them. I think in terms of place setting them, they're sort of broken down into a few things. The first thing is obviously internal Middle Eastern relations, because that's a Middle East debate. The second thing is both Western and Asian relations with the Middle East. And again, often these aren't directly inferred by the motion, especially the West usually is. Like usually the motion will be something like, this House believes that the US should like do good relations with Saudi Arabia. With Asian markets, it's sometimes a bit more clandestine. So just be careful when you're addressing a more regionally based debate. Often they will involve the Middle East in some capacity. I'll prove that to you. Cool. Oil states, we're usually referring to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait. I put the Middle East, the UAE in brackets. This is also an oil state, just to be clear, although some scholars and some journalists say it's not, it is. When we talk about post-oil states, we mainly talk about Lebanon and Bahrain. Again, in brackets, the UAE. Some people say it's in transition, some people say it isn't. Again, I'll show to you that post-oil state also isn't the most useful term to use, but these are just things that people use to refer to the Middle East. Okay, we're going to start with Aramco, which is the largest oil company which exists within the Middle East. I think the first thing to note is that it is the second largest company in the world by revenue. So to say that the ubiquitousness of Aramco on the global market doesn't exist would be a false claim, because it is probably the most ubiquitous company that exists right now. And they have a 100% share of the seven of the 10 largest oil fields in the Middle East, and it's also state-owned. Yes, question.
What does ubiquitous mean?
Like
everywhere.
Everywhere, ever present. A cool thing I found out about Aramco. So, Aramco Financial Services Company. That sounds like a bank, doesn't it? It's not a bank. It's not a bank. It is a deal they have with the United States Coast Guard. Basically, what this deal says is that the supply lines of Aramco oil between Saudi Arabia and the United States will be guaranteed by the United States Coast Guard. What this actually means is that the US Coast Guard has a large presence in both the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. So essentially what this means is that Aramco is the only corporation that operates in the Middle East that has its supply lines completely protected from piracy, and also has its supply lines completely protected from other sorts of competition, because the US Coast Guard is just chilling there with them. So notably, the way you can analyze this in terms of other countries that exist within the Middle East is like countries like Somalia or Seychelles that want to do this kind of oil extraction from deep sea oil. It's kind of hard to do that because there's 29 Aramco tankers just chilling in the Indian Ocean, and then their supply lines are also guaranteed by the US Coast Guard. All these other states are likely, or all these other companies that are trying to come up in these states would likely be victims of pirates, or the US Coast Guard would bully them into not mining in that field because Aramco is mining in that oil field. The second important thing with Aramco is that they are the largest investor in and supply to second sector oil. So that is to say, and these are just refineries, right? That is to say that when there are oil refineries in places like the EU, the US, Canada, China, where they export a lot of oil, but they don't extract the amount of oil that they export. That is to say that they import oil to refine. I think they take crude oil and do like the harbor process, or maybe it's the contact process. I can't remember, one of the two, right? And after this process is the point where you can sell it in petroleum jelly, and kerosene. So at that point, it is Aramco that is doing all the initial export for these refineries to be able to stay. Notably on this point, that like a lot of people basically say that Aramco does this diplomatically. It's state-run, so the state can use diplomatic incentives when Aramco is making certain decisions. And what this means is basically there are refineries in Saudi Arabia. They probably do have the capacity to refine all of their own oil, but insofar as there are existing oil industries that are doing refining in other countries, if Saudi Arabia wants to maintain relations wants to like ensure relationships with those countries, then obviously you just keep exporting oil to those refineries, and then all of their production and export of oil is kind of predicated on Aramco's initial export of oil, of crude oil to them. So it's just some examples of refineries that they basically not have control over, but have a majority investment and the supply into. So like Reliance Industries in India, Fujian refineries in China, Motiva Industries in the USA. There's also really big refineries in South Korea and Japan, where Aramco is the majority exporter to. And notably, and I'm about to do a cool thing with maps, right? But notably, the competitiveness of oil, as in the initial extraction of crude oil, has been significantly dropped in recent years because of significant embargoes and significant sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, which basically means that Saudi Arabia has the crude oil potential, like, uncompetitively, and also has it basically with impunity. Cool. Let's do some maps, right? Oh, well, that's nice, isn't it? Great. What happened? Oil map of the world. Right. So let's explore this oil map and see where crude oil exists. So we've got like some in Canada, US, South America, Africa over here, and then we have some oil that exists in Europe, loads in the Middle East over here. So noticeably Aramco is headquartered around there. And then there's loads of oil fields that stretch into both the UAE, Saudi Arabia, northern Saudi Arabia, lots in Iran. Then if you go over this side, there's some around India, Pakistan, and then China, etc. The importance of this is where is the crude oil coming from, right? Because North Sea, the oil has run out, and there are significant regulations in the United Kingdom. US, Canada, significant regulations, and second sector oil is cheaper than first sector oil because hydraulic fracking is like really politically unsexy in democratic states. India, Pakistan, well, this causes like a diplomatic issue, so they don't want to mine there. And also the US Coast Guard is like milling about here. Australia, they have better exports to do like uranium, so oil or crude oil extraction is not that big there. Developing. Who's doing the crude oil then? It's all Saudi Arabia, basically. Like they have asymmetric capacity over pretty much every other state to do crude oil extraction, so they're the ones that are doing it. That's why Aramco is so ubiquitous. And on to the next map. So Eli very kindly provided me with this map. Notice how the primary export of so many states is still petroleum. So we're talking still Canada, US, Russia, like so many of the Gulf states, India, and also like a lot of these industries are also predicated on your ability to have oil. Things like transmission apparatus in China is also predicated on your ability to have oil in the first place. So this is to say that all of these countries that are exporting so much petroleum, but have the majority of their oil exporting capacity is predicated on second sector refineries. That is the point where you have to buy from Aramco, basically.
Is this in terms of revenue?
I think it's in terms of
percentage of GDP, if I recall correctly.
Percentage of GDP, translated into the percentage of the exports which they do. So of their total exports, which takes a large percentage of GDP. Cool. So yeah, that's a brief explanation of Aramco and why basically they have asymmetric capacity to do so much mining and have so much money. So yeah. Cool. Moving into the other Middle Eastern oil sector things. So firstly, Kuwait, Iraq, and the UAE are all still pretty big in the Middle Eastern oil market. They all have an oil field which is top 10 in production in the Middle East. The key point here is that all of these oil companies that exist in these four oil giants, so I'm talking Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the UAE, is that they are all publicly traded, they're all commercial, but they are state-owned enterprises. So basically the state runs them like a business, and to some extent, each of these states has a majority share within the business. So in Saudi Arabia, for Aramco, I believe the king is a majority shareholder. In the UAE, the Abu Dhabi extraction group, well, that's not what they're called, but the group that does the extraction, that is based in Abu Dhabi, as a majority shareholder from the sheikhs in the royal family, which means, or they have a lot of ministers that are on the executive board. What this necessarily means is that, especially given that Middle Eastern states in general don't take a lot of tax, if any, so the income tax is really, really low, VAT is really, really low. They need other ways of being able to generate revenue. So this is the main way they do it. They basically just run their oil industries, and then they incur the revenue on this. When we cover sovereign wealth funds, that's another way where a lot of these Middle Eastern states gain revenue. The second thing to say is that they're pretty much too big to fail. One second. Which is to say that firstly, they're a likely candidate for state bailouts. So if they are doing badly, the state will just pump more money into them if they have the capacity to pump in this money. Notably in the Middle East, especially in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there's a lot of gold and a lot of other resources which are extremely valuable. So they do have backing to be able to do these kinds of bailouts in the first place. The second thing is that they're a likely candidate for foreign bailouts, especially if your state is suffering from a drawback in like Aramco oil services, then you have an incentive to bail them out if it is the case that your refineries are going to get done down. Tom, your question.
Is there some way to like prove in a debate why they have such low taxes?
Okay, so the first thing is to prove that the network of exchange generally in Islam is not like, it's not haram, that's like, don't just say Sharia law and but like, for example, incurring interest is also prohibited by Islam. So that is the first thing, to say large networks of accumulated capital based on another person's like smaller amounts of wealth is like kind of frowned upon in Islam. I think the second thing to do is just refer back to these things and refer to all the enterprises which they have, because they probably have the capacity to not tax people very highly if their businesses are doing well. The third thing is that a lot of these states are highly predicated on immigration. Notably, especially what we will be covering later on, not Iran and Turkey, because they have very high populations, but countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and the UAE have pretty low populations and really low population density. So then they, like, the expansion of their industries is often predicated on a lot of immigration, a lot of expatriation of people that live in places like Europe, etc. They also want to upskill a lot of their businesses, so they tend to poach from Europe, which means that to attract them, they have really low taxes. This is also quite common. Done.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to get to it eventually, but I guess the other thing is maybe not just that they're too big to fail, it's also that the price of oil is dictated by the policy of the government in many ways. Like, for example, like, I think it was today, there was reporting in the FT about like Saudi Arabia was going to fail to meet the $100 target, which is that like because the price of oil is so variable, because it's so cheap to extract, the governments use the SOEs as a way to like dictate foreign policy by controlling the price of oil.
Yeah, so for the recording that didn't get that, yeah, that's right. Basically that there's a lot of capacity for these states to basically control the price of oil, insofar as they're not just too big to fail, but they dictate. Like based on their policies, that's where the oil price ends up ending up. Cool. That's on that on the oil sector. I think the reason I brought up like post-oil states is just having a look at what these industries look like, because I think there's a lot to suggest that Middle Eastern countries, especially the ones that are developing very quickly, so Saudi Arabia and the UAE being the main examples, but Oman, even though it's not as predicated on oil, but Kuwait as well, is that they're generally shifting away from oil becoming a large portion of their GDP. So, for example, the UAE, currently oil-related activities, mining and quarrying, is at 32% of GDP. In Saudi Arabia, it's 43%. So this is why the UAE is often cited as a post-oil state, because it's kind of regressing from oil a bit quicker than the other states. But notably, Saudi Arabia had more of an oil-based economy pre-COVID. The UAE did as well. I couldn't find an exact stat on it, but it's had it somewhere between 40 and 50%. So notably, ever since ever since COVID, and like this is the classic debate analysis, like states are not stupid. These countries are not stupid. They know that oil will run out at some point. They're looking to diversify their sectors, etc. Notably, this is also analysis when talking about Middle Eastern social policy, right? Because at the point where you have oil is probably at the point where you can do a lot of really bad things like the workforce. You like don't let women work and things like that, because your economy is predicated on oil. But notably, when you're trying to shift from oil, you need to upskill into other sectors, especially in the service-based sectors. Notably, the UAE is really going into things like retail trade and financial and insurance activities, and so is Saudi Arabia. So notably, at this point, you need to do things like upskill and need to do things like poach good talent. And at this point, probably it is the case that if you're trying to poach good talent, for example, from other countries, that is the point where you need to have better labor laws and things like that. So the progressive nature of, for example, labor laws in the Emirate of Dubai or in Saudi Arabia overall has generally been on the trend towards being slightly better, insofar as they're trying to do things like upscale, diversify, etc. Because they know that oil will run out. But we'll cover that in just a second, and why that also might not be the case. Cool. Just a quick note on Lebanon and Bahrain. So Bahrain is running out of oil because it's like teeny tiny, so it doesn't have a lot of oil. That's actually kind of the main reason. They had a lot of oil, they don't really have it anymore. Bahrain is basically, so in the Middle East it's sort of perceived as either an entertainment hub or a tourism hub. I guess they kind of come hand in hand. So a lot of their economy is now being predicated more and more on tourism. In terms of Lebanon, so they hadn't found oil for a very long time until recently. but it's probably not enough oil to be competitive with big like oil extraction companies like Aramco or the ones that exist in the UAE or Kuwait. And the economy is still 66% in the service sector. Notably, Lebanon, more asymmetrically to some of these other countries, or more dissimilarly from these other countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, has been ravaged by war from a lot of its history. So its ability to be able to do things like crude oil extraction, like with impunity, like Saudi Arabia, is significantly lower. So a lot of the time these are referred to as post-oil states. I'm not sure this is the most useful way to refer to them, but like often, like to differentiate them from oil states, this is what they're referred to as. Cool. UAE and MR. So MR basically, I don't know if any of you guys have been to the United Arab Emirates, but if you go there, basically you'll like drive by and like every tower and like every building will have MR written on it. It's just a real estate firm. It's a real estate development firm. So it's the sixth largest company in the UAE. So it's not like this like mega company that is super important. But the reason I bring it up is that it's the largest not state-run enterprise in the United Arab Emirates. It kind of is state-run a little bit because the Sheikh of Dubai has a 40% shareholding, but like its operations are dictated by an independent CEO. Their founder is not a member of the royal family or anything like that. And it's it's the 25th largest in the world, largest real estate developer in the world by market cap. Again, this doesn't sound very big, but given that the United Arab Emirates has basically been, like in terms of real estate, an economy that's only been doing real estate in a major way since about the 1980s. Comparatively, the top 25 is basically dominated by US-based companies, and then I think there's like one in Japan, one in Hong Kong, and then one in India. So, given that, it's probably actually quite impressive that the extent to which real estate could develop this quickly in the United Arab Emirates was able to happen. It's still 10 times smaller than Evergrande at its peak. So to put it into scale, against the kinds of development that happened in China, especially leading up to now they're having economic decline, but leading up to that point, the kind of development they had. That just puts it in scale to an extent. So I think there's probably a lot more growth for companies like MR to happen. The key thing here is MR builds a lot of I think in the US often they're called, it's not quite port barreling, because port barreling is building something pointless. But they build things like the Burj Khalifa, the Dubai Mall, and huge
Vanity projects.
Vanity projects, that's the right word. Vanity projects. So they build really lavish sort of things, and they focus on the sort of luxury real estate industry. And these are just some notable things they built. Notably, a lot of people basically cite this as the UAE's ability, or at least MR's ability, to impose soft power of the Emirati princes abroad. Because for example, if you're a voter in Hyderabad and your local government is actually I don't really like this convention center, or I don't really like the UAE, and we want to do relations with other people, voters are nah, but MR's chill as hell because they built us our convention center, or they built us our Crescent Bay, and these range from individual projects to really, really big projects. So for example, Crescent Bay in Karachi is a whole neighborhood of sort of luxury things and shopping malls, etc. Or downtown Erbil in Iraq is an entire downtown, and it is pretty much entirely constructed by MR. I bring up the 2009 housing crisis because, sorry, this is a bit misleading. MR didn't need a state bailout, but the Emirate of Dubai needed a state bailout from the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. So basically, the Abu Dhabi prince gave a bunch of money to his brother, and the reason for this is that there was significant deflation in the housing industry in Dubai. Notably, the Sheikh of Dubai has come out recently and said that there's been excess home building in the status quo, and given firstly the war in Russia and Ukraine, and also the UK cost of living crisis, which were the two largest buyers of real estate in Dubai up until now basically, there have been significant drops of price of MR properties. The reason for this, they just built a bunch of high-rise apartments that were so luxury and priced them all at $451,000, and then now they're losing buyers, so there isn't the kind of demand for this kind of product in the first place. So economists fear a deflationary spiral in the real estate business in the UAE. So like, I think this is analysis you can probably cross-apply to either deflation spirals, real estate, building a bunch of houses, the luxury market, soft power, things like that. I also just think MR is interesting, because if you ever go through Dubai, like, literally everything has MR written on it. Like, it's kind of crazy. Cool. Okay, it's time for Turkey and Iran. Does anyone have any questions on that first section? Okay, fine, let's dive in. We're going to start with Iran.
Oh wait, I was
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
Are there examples where they got bailed out by like organizations like the IMF? Things that happen a lot.
I'll look into that. As in, do you mean the states or
Like
do you
the
mean
oil
the oil companies? I'll look into that. I don't know. I don't know of Aramco because it's been pretty stable since 1960. And the analysis is just that it would be a likely candidate for it.
Sure.
Yeah. And if they're irresponsible with things like fracking or whatever, then yeah. Elishra.
Just because I've heard competing analysis on this, do Middle Eastern oil companies and countries like operate in competition to each other, or do they form like oil cartels and then like function as a bloc and try to outcompete the rest of the world and just like have a monopoly of oil collectively?
So your capacity to be competitive is predicated on your capacity to do crude oil extraction in the first place. So, like, the spec I've given you would broadly suggest that Saudi Arabian oil is, well, the other kinds of oil are pretty uncompetitive related to Saudi Arabian oil because, like, they've got the US Coast Guard and they've got like so many oil networks. I think in terms of the UAE and Kuwait and stuff, I think there are international agreements that exist that allow them to be competitive in like the broad sphere. I'm unsure that this means that they can ever outcompete Saudi Arabia, and I think that's like that. Yeah.
So they more function individually rather than like carteling and
Yeah.
driving up oil prices.
Yeah.
Okay.
What about OPEC?
Oh, I was just about to ask, like, I've heard about OPEC a lot, I've read like certain things about it. Just generally, how does it function? Who holds power in it, and how does it relate to like other large international organizations in the world?
I have no idea the internal functionings of OPEC. Like I don't know whether like people within like as in states within OPEC have like asymmetric voting power, etc. I just know that OPEC is predicated on like kind of what Elishba said, which is ensuring that some of these smaller countries stay competitive within the oil market. So for example, Equatorial Guinea is an OPEC state, and like they haven't been completely outcompeted by Saudi Arabia, so there are agreements in place that like prove that they interact in that way. But like I think other than that, they're just kind of favoring the sort of like free market of oil. They just impose some regulations of what member states can do, and like not being like extremely pernicious with the invisible hand of the free market. I don't know how it interacts with other international organizations. Like I presume that OPEC is somewhat supported. Like most countries are pretty predicated on it. Yeah. Any other questions, Don?
Yeah, I was going to say on OPEC, I think it's kind of interesting because I think that OPEC does kind of operate like a cartel, but I think the best way to maybe analyze oil in a debate is more in terms of it being like a diplomatic thing. So if you look at like the 1973 oil price spike that came off Keynesianism, that was driven less by an actual increase in the price of oil compared to a diplomatic desire by Arab states to basically get back at the US for what Israel was paying at the time. So even though that's now ending because oil is becoming more expensive, OPEC still is primarily through a diplomatic lens. But then on the question, how successful do you think like these countries have been at diversifying? Because one example I can think of is like Argentina was like the richest country in the world because they were expecting like exporting so much like beef basically during the war, and then like they just completely imploded afterwards. Like, do you think in general these states are doing as badly as that or marginally better?
I think they're doing better. Firstly, for the reason that they're able to attract a lot of like foreign talent and or already upskilled talent insofar as they have low taxes. I think the other thing, it's the classic like institutional knowledge thing, like they can learn from other examples. I think the last thing is that I think the Argentina story was predicated on a lot of like enterprises selling beef and then like the diversification based on that not happening well. I think the thing here is that a lot of the diversification is very state heavy, so the state has large control of diversification. So whether that proves to be good or not in the end, like we'll see. But currently, like I think it's going decently alright. I think the last thing on the OPEC thing, because Dom is right, so basically with oil being used as soft power and or hard power against existing like parties that are really predicated on Arab oil for their oil refineries. Like it can be used as a diplomatic tool. So it is probably the case that if OPEC diplomatically with each other decides that we don't like the West, for example, then yeah, they can kind of cartelize the oil. So Alishba, the capacity for cartelizing does exist. It's just like probably not all the time it happens. Like especially in times where like Saudi Arabia is exporting to the US. Like they don't all collectivize or not export to the US. Cool. Any other questions? Let's move into Turkey and Iran. I put basics of Turkey and Iran at the start. These are like actually basics. I would implore that after this, or if you're more interested, you look more into it, because there's so much more to say about two entire countries. Cool. Starting with Iran and the Ayatollah. So this is exhaustive capacities, functions, and powers of the Supreme Leader of Iran list that I found in Wikipedia. The important analysis here is what the Ayatollah is and what they do. So the Ayatollah, which frequently refers to the Supreme Leader of Iran. There's only ever been two Supreme Leaders of Iran. There's Imam Khomeini, and now there's Khomeini. And that's it. So, you know, that's all you need to know. And like, I tried to look into their appointments process. It was somewhat nebulous. They're just, there's a Supreme Leader, they do Supreme Leader things to get there. The second thing Ayatollah could mean is referring to high-ranking scholars in the 12 Shia clergy of Islam, right? So most Muslims worldwide are Sunni, but there is a Shia sect of Islam, and most of them can be found in Iran. So that is to say that these clergy that are also Ayatollah, that are high scholars in interpreting Shia law, they're kind of like kept very active in Iran, and like the Ayatollah tells the Ayatollah like what to do, and the Ayatollah like refers back to the Ayatollah, and then like no, but the key analysis here, and I remember hearing it in the final at Urin where Max Rosen was talking about the Ayatollah a lot, and basically like the Ayatollah kind of sees the Ayatollah as the only legitimate form of being able to interpret Islamic law in Iran. So usually this is kind of the like cooperation of people that the Ayatollah will listen to. But if you get confused between the two, just say Supreme Leader and Ayatollah, like it's fine. Or you can say, I think you can say Grand Ayatollah and Ayatollah. I think that's fine. The second thing is that they appoint so follow this logical flow. They appoint the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Ayatollah also appoints 6 Faqihs to the Guardian Council. The other 6 members are nominated by Parliament. No, they're nominated from Parliament, but they are approved by the Chief Justice. So notice the flow, right? So appoints the Chief Justice, appoints 6 of the 12 members of the Guardian Council, and the other 6 are basically appointed by the Chief Justice. So 12 of them are appointed by the Ayatollah. And then, yeah, so the Guardian Council must approve all nominees to Parliament and for the presidency of Iran. So the Guardian Council, made up by 6 guys that this guy picks, and 6 guys that this guy picks, that is picked by this guy, appoints all members to Parliament. So Parliament is voted, but they have to approve the Parliament that comes in, and also the presidency is voted on. Again, must be approved. The Ayatollah has basically supreme control over Iran. This is an important thing to note when talking about like capacity of the Iranian state to do things, or noticeably, I think it was in Sophia Online Open Part 2, was it Part 2? Yeah, the final was like, this house predicts the coming liberalization of Iran. This is all analysis as to what the state has the capacity to do. If you move to this side, like I think the important things are Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, all of these people which you appoint, dismiss, and or resign, basically ministers and or like important people, and then formalizing elections in Iran and signing that decree. Again, the Ayatollah has supreme control over these things. Cool.
The final was recorded if anyone wants to watch the opposition bench, which were really good at just like explaining.
Were you on the opposition?
No, I was on the opposition.
I do think Dan Alex did that debate. If you watch CG, they're but yeah, closing opposition, that debate, really, really good. I think in terms of Iran, what I'll cover is just a couple of protests that are important. The first lot of protests I'll cover are the Masa media protests. And hopefully you guys know a lot about this, or at least have heard of this before. So the timescale of this is 2022 to 2023. and basically described as the biggest challenge to the Iranian government since the Islamic Revolution. The Islamic Revolution happened back in the 1970s, basically converted the kingdom, like the monarchy that existed in Iran, to an Islamic republic. This is when the Ayatollah came in and did all that and made the constitution so you could do all that. And since then, this has probably been the largest protest which has been in opposition to the government. So during the course of this, at least 551 people were killed, and the regime themselves said that they had arrested tens of thousands of protesters. So what it was a direct response to was police brutalization of Mahsa Amini. She was accused of not wearing her hijab in line with state regulations. And this is probably the best example of social protest in Iran. So notably, if you're talking about dissent in Iran, or you're talking about political opposition in Iran, a lot of the other protests that happened previously to this were concerning economic issues, such as like strange regulations that the state was doing, or concerning more political issues like the Ayatollah has too much power. But noticeably on this one, it was a direct response to extremely stringent social regulations on women in Iran. So noticeably, this like probably demarcates some sort of shift towards like, I don't want to say political consciousness in Iran, as if people didn't have that, but like a consciousness to the extent to which people are ready to protest against the government. The Ayatollah and the state were able to basically crush this with riot police and like the army and stuff like that. Notably though, it had significant traction on social media, and a lot of like Iranian people that had a lot of influence, such as the Iranian football team, supported the Mahsa Amini protests and the protesters that were happening. So for example, at the World Cup, the Iranian football team like wore T-shirts in solidarity with Mahsa Amini, the protests that were happening. So there is a diversity to the extent to which people like probably feel about political and social issues in Iran. It's just the difference in the capacity of the state to be so oppressive.
I think something else related to the protest that depicts the capacity of Iran is that when this happened and people fled to go protest in like the UK from Iran, Iran sent like operatives into the major protests in London and Glasgow, and they have facial recognition technology at the airports and during these protests, where people are taking pictures to see who is in attendance at these protests, and when they come to Iran, they'll get like jailed. It's become so bad that in UK precedent for asylum law, that if you claim political asylum, if you're from Iran, even if it's a falsified claim, they have to legitimately grant it to you, because the risk of returning to Iran if you like politically oppose the government publicly is so big that you would be assassinated. So even if the claim is like facetious, the Iranian government has massive capacity to crack down against protesters internationally.
Yeah. So if you guys didn't hear that in the recording, it's just discussing how the Iranian government has significant capacity to be able to crush down dissent, not just within home but abroad. So they use facial recognition features to be able to track down people in protests at London and Glasgow.
To what extent did the Iranian football team face repercussions for, allying with the protesters?
So notably, most of the Iranian football team don't live in Iran because they play abroad during during the season. I think the extent, they're all still alive and none of them are in jail, to my knowledge. So based on that, if they have been back, I'm not sure they've been cracked down on. So I think then it's weighing up what the state would perceive the reaction against their football team to be, for example. But to be honest, I'm not sure they've been back to Iran. So, Dom?
Yeah, I would just say on the thing that Alicia said, it's really interesting that the thing I saw, which is actually I think almost worse, is that the UK hosts the largest sort of radio station for distant Iranian politics news, and the Iranian government have been doing sort of active operations. I think they managed to assassinate or attempted to assassinate basically the leader, and they managed to get the whole thing shut down. So the level of Iranian involvement in UK politics is really, really high.
Yeah, so for those of you that didn't hear it on the recording, there's just high levels of Iranian involvement in foreign politics and foreign dissent against the Iranian government, either done by or not done by Iranians. Cool. The next lot of protests we'll be looking at is bloody November. Let's get it going. Cool. So basically, this is in November 2019. It was a reaction against price hikes and fuel rationing done by the Iranian government. The product of this was that fuel prices rose by about 50 to 200%. Again, the number is a bit unclear. I think it peaked at around 200%. The average was about 50. The protests led to basically an internet shutdown, and then there was a lot of destruction of a lot of things, such as banks, etc. And once again, Iran killed they killed over 1,500 people. So the degree to which the Iranian state did a significant amount of crackdown on this protest, especially, was extremely severe. They killed more people. They shut down the entire internet for the entire country. So if you compare to the other protests and the extent to which the Iranian state is probably not more cautious, but maybe more calculated in the extent to which they crack down on protests. It's definitely been getting more and more calculated over time, because this one is probably more overt. There are some other points here, such as it had significant backing from students. The Mahsa Amini protest also did. And yeah, the key point here, over the two things, that the Ayatollah has basically supreme power to stop these protests. They use the guidance patrol, which is a separate branch which the Ayatollah has supreme power over. They use the army. They use a lot of anti-West messaging on social media, so they basically do a lot of coercion on people's Twitter and stuff like that. They're saying that the Mahsa Amini protest or Bloody November was promoted by United States people that are now infiltrating our country, and they weaponize people's anti-West sentiment within these countries, within Iran, in order to put them back on side with the state. So this is quite common. Again, if you're ever talking about the capacity of the state to be able to crack down on protests, you can use these examples. But what I would defer to is basically the powers and the capacities of the Ayatollah. That's probably quite important. Yes?
On the Iranian population, I think it's also important to note that the act, what the population believes and wants, is very separate to what the state is actually enforcing. Iran used to have a very high culture of political dissent and involvement. I think voter turnout, even back in the 90s, was 85 to 90%, which is far higher than most Western states. But it's decreasing quite heavily recently. So the recent turnout only had 40%. But it is also, despite the fact of it having such a low turnout, they still voted for the most liberal politician they could have, which is Pezeshkian, to be their prime minister, I think is what it's called. But obviously it's hard to know how much the population agrees or disagrees. I think the majority of dissent does come within university spaces or with the middle class of Iran, which is slowly rising. So it's interesting to see how that will evolve.
Yeah, Wudan is right here. It's hard to know the exact preferences of these people. Sorry, you guys. Yeah.
The only other really interesting thing on the recent voter turnout is that rural areas had much higher turnout than urban areas, which was a reversal of what was expected even leading up to the election. And then it played out interestingly.
Yeah, very cool. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. So yeah, the broad thing here is especially in debating context, and why people still buy into the Iranian state and who is buying in, because if you're analyzing this, you need to evaluate why the guidance patrol and the Supreme Court and people like that still buy into the Ayatollah. And this is where you use basically classic cronies analysis, because Iran, and we'll cover sovereign wealth funds, Iran also has a sovereign wealth fund where there's reports of a lot of embezzlement, and then you're given money and other positions of power, things like that. Jonah.
I guess it's if you want to argue that perhaps the Iranian state has more room for liberalization or things in that direction. One thing that might be interesting to note but is disputed is that some people argue that the Iranian state is actually two-sided. So there is the secular side, which comes from the pre-Islamic Revolution period. Theoretically, the army is secular, that's Ba'atash, and then there's a whole separate section that was superimposed after the Islamic Revolution. So this would be the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yeah.
When it comes to suppressing internal protests, generally the IRGC plays a bigger role, and then the army plays a supporting role or tries to deny its role a little bit. So that would be where you can try to argue that there's actually a little bit of pluralism within the Iranian state.
Yeah. So for those of you that didn't hear it, it's just there is existing capacity given the secular sect of Iran. Dom?
Yeah, I would say the cronyism thing, I think, is increasingly becoming a bigger part. But in cases, I would probably also analyze the history of Iran.
Yeah.
Because I think there is a reason why there at least was in the past massive popular support in Iran for an anti-Western position, which is just they overthrew Mossadegh, installed the Shah, whoever it is.
Yeah. Okay.
How can you be certain that the numbers about voter turnout are accurate?
I'm uncertain on this. I don't know.
The numbers are speculative.
Yeah,
They're not
the numbers
certain.
are probably pretty speculative.
The reason why Iran even has elections that even allows like some liberal left people to even run. I mean, they're not very lefty at all, but like they're still more liberal than the others.
Yeah, that's actually
is-
important. The Supreme Leader has veto power over the list of presidential nominees, like Aymaan said earlier, so the fact that this guy was even allowed to be on the ballot was a massive win.
But like the reason why they allow that sort of stuff is to give the air of legitimacy towards the state, which is why I think they still have like elections and try and still maintain to some extent the fairest elections the Ayatollah wants to have, which is why we're able to have some level of legitimacy towards it.
Legitimacy analysis, I like it. Cool. Moving into Turkey and Turkish politics. Again, this is quite a simplistic overview. So the first important thing to note is the 2017 Turkish constitutional referendum. So it abolished the office of the Prime Minister and basically turned Turkey into a presidential democracy. It created a president which had executive powers, so the president had more power. The notable thing about the 2017 referendum is it passed by like less than 2 percentage points, I think, or at least like around 2 percentage points. It was like 51 point something and 49 point something. So the degree to which people in the status quo agree to like presidential democracy in Turkey is very divided. Yes.
The really important thing about that number is that Turkey has incredibly strong voting from
Right.
people overseas,
Yeah.
and people overseas tend to be much more conservative than people within Turkey themselves.
There you go. Yeah, I'm sure people heard that as another recording. In terms of Erdogan, again, I assume a lot of you know a lot about him. I'm not going to list every policy that he has, but the broad context behind him is that he was Prime Minister before running for President in 2014. So de facto, Turkey's been ruled by Erdogan since like 2003, something like that. He won the 2023 election by 5 percentage points, and a lot of polls around this time had his running mate is the wrong word. That's the person that runs with you. The person that was running against him, Kemal, had him likely to win, and he lost by like 5 percentage points on average across both the first and the runoff. And there was a 6-party coalition that backed Kemal, and Erdogan was still able to win. I think this indicates incongruence with what Eli said, at least some sort of buy-in to what Erdogan is doing, in spite of all the anti-Greek narratives and the inflation and things like that. An important thing to note is the Gezi Park protests in 2013. So millions of people took part of this protest. 22 were killed, 8,000 were injured. And it's basically just initially a response to replacing Gezi Park with a shopping mall, but it escalated given that, in the chronology at the time, Erdogan was doing a lot of other things that were really unpopular in parliament, such as a refusal to extend LGBTQ rights, ban the sale of alcohol after 10 p.m., egregious, I know, and more frequent use of riot police. So yeah, basically, once again, we're basically looking at the capacity that exists within Turkey to do political dissidence against the government within the first place. Notably, comparatively to the last, there probably is some sort of more capacity to do this, although Erdogan is known to be extremely harsh on protesters. He's known to get the police out. He's known to do a lot of rhetoric on social media that are against these people within the first place. There was an attempted coup in 2016. It was just like a coup with people that had the capacity to do a coup, i.e. a wing of the military that didn't buy into the state in the first place. The important thing to note here is that it was crushed, firstly by the other part of the army and by the police, but a lot of people on the ground that were pro-government protesters also chipped in to try and defeat these people. So this is to say that there is a wing of people in Turkey that buy into Erdogan a lot and would literally get off their asses, come out the house and fight for him if it was necessary. There was a lot of them that were involved in this coup. The last thing that's important in their politics, their mandatory voting laws, it's not criminalized and it's not enforced. So you won't go to jail if you won't vote, but it is decreed in law. And it does mean that they have really high election turnout. So 2023 had an average turnout of around 85.5%. Again, looking at Turkish democracy and the extent to which there probably is capacity for a decent degree of democracy in Turkey. Cool. Last thing on Turkey and the EU, and then I believe, we'll move into sovereign wealth funds, and then we'll move into a motion prep. Yeah. So again, very briefly on Turkey and the EU, there are kind of 3 things that are broadly pinned, as the major reasons that are delaying Turkish accession to the European Union. You guys, between you can probably think of 200. But the three main reasons are, firstly, Turkey refuses to recognize Cyprus. The reason for this is their ongoing occupation of northern Cyprus, which they proclaim as an independent country called the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. No one else in the world recognizes Northern Cyprus. It's just Turkey, and they also don't recognize Cyprus. It's an EU member state. It's kind of a problem. Like, if you want to be a member of the EU. The second thing is the treatment of Kurdish minorities in the Kurdistan region of southern Turkey. There have been like significant reports of like military and police profiling of the Kurdish region. There have been reports of like a lot of extraction in this region and basically profiling of Kurdish people and not granting rights to Kurdish people in the same way that Turkish people have it. Again, this doesn't meet the conditions of EU membership. The third thing is that they just don't meet a lot of the internal conditions that the EU has. The EU has like over 280 conditions for you to join, and Turkey, the last time I checked, only meets one of them, which is science and research, and doesn't meet any of the others. So basically they have a long way to go until they're able to join the European Union. Although the interesting thing is though Erdogan is such a strongman leader, does a lot of rhetoric against Greece, a lot of rhetoric against the West even sometimes, it maintains it still wants to be a European Union member. So this is just a thing to note when talking about like rhetoric that exists within the sphere of the European Union and also within the sphere of Turkey. Another reason why it's often said that Turkey can't join the EU, I do find this to be somewhat persuasive, so I included it, is that there's a lot of Islamophobia and anti-Turk racism in significant EU member states. So like France, Germany, and Austria namely. Like I went to Hungary and I went to the National Museum of Hungary, and it was wonderful, but like literally every like historical thing was like, and we did this because we didn't like the Turks, and it was crazy. Like they just don't like the Turks in Central Europe. So it's probably good in these cases to analyze the historical opposition towards the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire had a lot of land that came in via Turkey, and also a lot of Turkish immigration into places like Germany. Like far-right rhetoric has talked a lot about the Turks in these countries since 2015, and also before that. So this is often cited as a reason why Turkey is unable to join the EU, because it would be very politically unsexy for any existing party like Germany or France or Austria to endorse this, because there's so much hatred and Islamophobia and xenophobia against Turkish people in these countries. Any questions on Iran and Turkey before I move quickly on sovereign wealth funds? Yes?
Yes, regarding what last part, actually, with regards to the position of the main parties, I think this has actually changed a bit. Because basically the main, the largest group in the European Parliament, the Christian Democrats, previously were against admitting Muslim majority countries into EU, but they have dropped this basically with the with the invasion of Ukraine back in 2014. They basically decided we need to really quickly expand the EU and especially admit Western Balkans. Some countries in Western Balkans like Albania and Bosnia are Muslim majority. The North Macedonia has 25% Muslim population, so they have basically decided we dropped this position, we are now completely okay with this. So I think this definitely applies for the patriots of Europe and other more extreme factions, but for the mainstream it I think does not longer apply.
Yeah, so for those of you that didn't hear it, basically there has been a changing and a shifting position in Europe, especially since the 2014 war in Ukraine and in Crimea. So for example, we've had ascension and or talks of ascension of states like Bosnia and Albania, etc. I do think notably on this one, one needs to look at firstly that Turkey is really, really big compared to these countries. The second one is that a lot of the racism is not anti-Muslim but anti-Turk specifically, so it does make it a little bit more difficult. Julia?
Yeah, I was just going to add to kind of pad out what you were saying in terms of current violations of human rights. There's also the historical aspect of violations of human rights, like the Armenian genocide being an obvious one.
Yeah.
But I was going to say interconnects with the far-right rhetoric, because there's still this narrative of despite them not being Muslim, them being necessarily anti-Christian, and that being not necessarily compatible with a lot of claims of EU historical Christianity and stuff like that.
Totally agree. Totally true. Right, let's move into sovereign wealth funds very quickly. A sovereign wealth fund is essentially a state-owned investment group. So they kind of operate a bit like any hedge fund or private equity firm that also does other investments. It's just a firm that does investments. 14 of the 25 largest sovereign wealth funds by net worth are based in the Middle East. And notably, this is one thing that does ubiquitously exist within the Middle East, quite big. Like, even countries that are quite different to states, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, like Turkey and Iran, do have sovereign wealth funds that are very big. They're all included in the top 25. And I'm talking like Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, they all have sovereign wealth funds. I don't know what the structural reason for this would be. They just have sovereign wealth funds. I don't know. Like, I think they kind of started like investing and they were like, yeah, this is kind of cool. Let's do it in the state. Like, again, I don't really know why it is the reason that sovereign wealth funds happen more in the Middle East than anywhere else, but they seem to happen. I think maybe the analysis here is, once again, given that they don't have very high taxes, they want other means of being able to generate revenue for the state. Again, this is another way they can probably do it, especially if they don't want to do oil. So the most important examples of these sovereign wealth funds are the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which is based in the United Arab Emirates, the Public Investment Authority, which is in Saudi Arabia. These are in order of how much they're worth. So the UAE one is bigger, the PIA is a bit smaller. And there's also the Kuwait Investment Authority. Again, that one's really big. These are the three biggest ones. I think they're 2, 3, and 4 in the world. The biggest sovereign wealth funds in Norway. I didn't know that, but like, you know. And yeah, so basically the analysis here is before like the 2010s, they worked very safely and they worked in very safe assets and equities, mainly in US Treasury bonds. However, recently they've been more heavily involved in either markets that make themselves look a bit sexier, so things like Nintendo and things like LIV Golf and Newcastle United. So the PIA did all the investments there. For example, like buying out Newcastle United. The other thing is investing in more risky things, and again, it's kind of it's kind of hard to put within their portfolios because they mainly on their pages list like their biggest investments, like the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority's investment in Heathrow Airport, for example. But noticeably, you can see that their trend is that they have fewer and fewer investments in things like US Treasury bonds. So often one can infer that they're investing in more risky things. The analysis here is that Asian markets are growing really, really quickly, and like Asian firms are growing really quickly. So things like Shein and things like that, and like Alibaba, etc. So they're diversifying the extent to which they're investing in different things. Yes.
I just saw a motion that was like, this house does not like whenever Western funds invest in Asia.
Yes.
Are Western funds also Middle Eastern funds, or is this different?
But the Middle Eastern funds are different.
Wonderful. So it would be the comparative is the Middle East does this instead.
Sovereign wealth funds could be a comparative to, for example, private equity firms investing, like Western private equity investing abroad, or Western hedge funds investing abroad. Often the comparative. So in this debate specifically, the debate was like, this house opposes private equity moving into the Asian markets. And like, I do think the likely comparative here is for these businesses to get a loan from an Asian bank, but also this could be a comparative, especially if they're diversifying into more risky things. It's probably quite easy to analyze why they're diversifying into somewhat more risky things. Oh yeah, and like the last thing is that they're just kind of, they're quite similar to the oil firms, insofar as they're, once again, kind of a bit too big to fail. The second thing is that they're very concentrated within the state. Again, it's another source of state revenue. Right. Any questions before? I don't think we'll have time for motion prep. I can show you guys the motion. You can talk about it for like 5 minutes, but we won't have like the motion prep time. Jonah?
I guess I can suggest maybe one reason why these sovereign wealth funds tend to be within the Middle East is also because of the oil industry, because a lot of these oil companies, like all states, they need to have some way to stabilize their, or like diversify their finances.
Mm-hmm.
So they go to sovereign wealth funds. And you can see this also in the countries that have sovereign wealth funds that are not in the Middle East, tend to also be petro states. So these are states like Brazil or Malaysia. I think Brunei also has one. It's like the East Asian sovereign wealth model, which does not use oil, is actually quite rare.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So if you guys are analyzing like why sovereign wealth funds are concentrating in the Middle East, to be honest, I don't think you'll have to do this. I think the AIB knows that there's lots of sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East. Like they know that like they bought Newcastle United and things like that. But if you have to analyze it, then yeah, that's probably a good reason. Dom.
I'm just interested in like how big do you think they are to be too big to fail? Because I just see SoftBank, and I think Matthew, as you saw, and I think the world's like dumbest investor of all time. So, like, is there a way to quantify the level of risk in an argument? Because that does seem to be a big shift from going like US Treasury bonds to like the world's dumbest investor.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. So is the question like how really are they too big to fail? Because presumably if they are getting riskier, then they perceive themselves as too big to fail.
Yeah, no, but I guess your argument is like on the last bit that they can outcompete privately established funds in Asia. But I'm just presumably there's lots of counter arguments that like they're run by the whims of whatever the government thinks at the time, which is often done
Like kind of badly,
yeah.
Yeah.
Or and then they're also like they've got like exposure now to other risky companies which they didn't previously.
I think this is true. So then the path to victory here is basically if you're trying to purport that these or say that these sovereign wealth funds don't make good decisions, then you need to prove why these states are likely to have bad decision making. Or asymmetrically, something like the Filipino fund that we were talking about earlier would have good decision making, or why privately established things would have good decision making. So yeah, you're right. Yes.
The kind of response to Dom's thing is if they're riskier, then they might like lose more, but they'll also make more money. And also because they're investing in a lot of things, that risk is kind of diversified across a bunch of different things. So the likelihood of each individual thing failing all at once is like so large that you might as well have like the global economy crash at that point. Like,
Yeah, fine. All right, fantastic. That's the end of the workshop.